Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles. And all the opinions you'll need, whether it's digital or by post. Subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. The first item of business today is general questions. Our first question is from Kezia, Dugdale.
To ask the Scottish Government how the Housing Minister aims to improve the transparency, accessibility and reporting of home adaptation funding.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Integration joint boards are responsible for the planning and delivery of adaptations. We are undertaking a review of existing legislation and guidance on adaptations, and this work has a practical focus, concentrating on identifying barriers and areas for development. We intend to issue revised guidance to IJBs later this year to ensure that the tenure-neutral, person-centred approach to adaptations that I want to see for all older and disabled people is happening consistently across the country. The Scottish Government publishes a range of information on expenditure on adaptations.
Kezia, Dugdale.
I thank the Minister for that answer. He's aware that the Scottish Government cash for home adaptations has been frozen for 7 years. Now that it's been absorbed into the IGBs, it's almost impossible to track the money in terms of the number of adaptations that take place or indeed the money spent. Given the clear link between the need for home adaptations and the demands on social care, does he agree that this urgently needs sorted out and we need to be able to follow the money, and when can we expect to do that?
Presiding Officer, I agree that we need to look at this in more depth, and that's why the review that I talked about is taking place. Obviously, the Scottish Government has provided £10 million a year over a number of years directly to RSLs for adaptations, but primarily, this is additional money. Primarily, all of this rests with IJBs. The Cabinet Secretary for Health, Jean Freeman, and I want to make sure that this is done right, is as open and transparent as it possibly can be, and that's why we agreed to undertake the review. And I'm sure that Parliament, I'll come back to Parliament, or Ms Freeman will come back to Parliament with more in depth on that once that's completed.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thanks. Kezia Dugdale is absolutely right. It's virtually impossible to follow the money under the current system, and that needs to be sorted out. But she mentioned that money for adaptations has been frozen at £10 million for 7 years. That's a real terms decrease of over £1 million. Doesn't the Minister not think it's time to increase that amount?
Minister.
As I said to Ms Dugdale in my answer to her, this is additional money. The primary responsibility for the budgeting of adaptations rests with integrated joint boards. They are the ones who should be ensuring that people's needs are met in this particular area. In the last year that we have figures for, 2016-17, the total reported spend by IJBs was some £38.413 million. I want to make sure that people know where this money is being spent. That's why we've agreed to undertake this review. That's why we've gone ahead with it. And that is the right thing to do.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd be grateful if the Minister could inform me if he's had any discussions with the Scottish Warblinded, who have got various numbers of grants and funds available to actually help particular people from the armed forces community who are blind and visually impaired.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm aware of the excellent work of the Scottish Warblinded and other veterans charities in supporting and delivering services to disabled veterans across Scotland. The Government's Housing Voluntary Sector Grant supports third sector organisations committed to helping disabled people live independently at home. For example, Housing Options Scotland operate Military Matters, which focuses on housing matters affecting service personnel, veterans and their families.
Question number 2, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government for what reason Transport Scotland requires disabled people to renew their National Entitlement Card every 3 years, including when they have a disability that is permanent or progressive.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Renewal is due on the grounds of disability, as documentary evidence is required to show that the person remains eligible to access the scheme. While there are some conditions which will be permanent, in the majority of cases circumstances can change. I appreciate that renewal may be an inconvenience for those with a condition. However, these measures are designed to ensure that only those people who are eligible have access to the scheme.
Stuart McMillan.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer? When we asked Transport Scotland about the policy, they said it was to ensure fairness for all disabled people are treated fairly. But how does a costly, demeaning and unnecessary process fit with the Scottish Government's ethos of treating people with dignity and respect?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member will be aware that the scheme does not operate on a condition-specific basis. Therefore, it has to operate in an equitable fashion for the 1.4 million people who have access to the existing National Entitlement Card, which is to ensure that it is only applied to those and provided to those who are entitled to it. The member should also be aware, because he certainly didn't reflect that in his supplementary question, is that the renewal process is a simplified process, which is very different from the reapplication process, in order to reduce the burden for individuals who are seeking to have a renewal of their card. So the process has been simplified in order to make it much easier for those who are seeking a renewal.
And Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have a constituent born with disabilities so severe that throughout her life she's been incapable of work or forming meaningful relationships. Her sibling deals with everything for her. Yet the UK Tory government has subjected her to 9 employment support allowance work capability assessments over the years. Even at 62, she was summoned to appear at Job Centre Plus in Ayr, many miles from her home for another. In this light, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it takes a shocking lack of self-awareness for Tory MSPs to come to this chamber and complain about National Entitlement Card renewal terms?
That question is rather wide of the mark, so a very, very brief response, Mr Minister.
No, sir, I do think it's an utter disgrace that constituents such as Kenny Gibson's have been put through such a degrading process, and the process which was used by the DWP is in no way similar to the process we use for the National Entitlement Card, which is a simplified process in order to make sure it's a dignified process for those who are applying for it.
Question number 3, Jenny Marra.
To ask the Scottish Government what information it can provide regarding the findings of Police Scotland's recent visit to Vietnam.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Since 2014, Vietnamese nationals have been the most frequently reported potential victims of trafficking through the national referral mechanism in Scotland. Labour exploitation was the most common exploitation types for both adults and children, but experience of multiple exploitation appears common both in transit and indeed on arrival. The National Human Trafficking Unit was invited by every child protected against trafficking to participate in a 2-part best practice exchange with Vietnam. Police Scotland met with representatives from the Vietnamese police, the Ministry of Public Security to discuss options for collaborative work in furtherance of the recently signed MOU between the UK Government and the Vietnamese Government.
Jenny Marra.
Presiding Officer, children arrive in Scotland from Vietnam on their own with no parent or anyone to look after them, trafficked here to be exploited sexually for their labour in nail bars and in cannabis farms in Scotland. Unaccompanied children are extremely vulnerable. That is why the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Act provided that the Scottish Guardianship Service would step in to give these children legal protection. But 3.5 years on, the Scottish Government has not yet enacted this provision. Vietnamese and other trafficked children still don't have a Scottish legal guardian that this government promised them. Why is this, Cabinet Secretary? And if you commit today to enacting Section 11, will you also please meet with me to discuss the scope of Section 11, as there are concerns that the Government will interpret it too narrowly and the will of Parliament to protect vulnerable children will not be fully realised by your Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I first recognise the work that Jenny Marra has done and the interest that she's taken in this issue, and of course we're very proud of that, breaking that legislation on independent child trafficking guardian, which we'll take forward in Section 11. What I would say to Jenny Marra is, of course, I will meet with her, and of course the Minister for Children and Early Years will be happy to meet with her, who's leading on this particular section of the Act. I do have some issue with the characterisation of the support. There is support available for unaccompanied children. It's through the Scottish Guardianship Service. I visited that service, which is provided by the Scottish Refugee Council in Aberlour, and of course gets £300,000 of Scottish Government funding. That works with and has worked with almost 400 young people since its inception in 2010. So let's not make the assumption that there's no support there for young people. There absolutely is. But the point that she raises actually is a very valid one. She asked me to meet with her because she has issues in and around the scope of Section 11. Because of those issues, actually, it's taken a bit longer to draft the consultation, but that consultation will be ready to go out in Section 11 in spring. If she wishes to meet with me or indeed the Minister for Children in Early Years, once that consultation has gone out, or indeed before that, then of course we were happy to have that conversation.
Question number 4, Alison Harris.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to reduce abuse against elderly people.
Minister Christina McKelvey.
Can I thank Alison Harris for that question? Abuse in our communities is unacceptable. No person should ever be subject to any form of abuse. We have made the ill treatment and willful neglect of adults receiving health and social care a criminal offence, and are currently consulting on the hate crime legislation, including the introduction of a statutory sentencing aggravation of age-related hostility.
Alison Harris.
I thank you for that answer, but recently in my region, several elderly people were abused by a member of staff at a care home facility. This ranged from degrading humiliation to physical abuse. No one should have to go through this, and elderly people are particularly vulnerable. However, the culprit was only sentenced to 90 hours of unpaid work. Does the Minister agree with me that crimes like this should be treated more seriously?
Minister.
Absolutely, and that's the reason why when in my opening remarks I explained to Alison Harris that we're currently consulting on an age-related hostility, aggravation and the hate crime legislation. She will know that the Care Commission have done some work around this, and also that everyone in Scotland has a right to a safe, compassionate, high-quality care which meets their needs and respects their rights. And in respecting those rights, we have to look at what Lord Bracadale has recommended in his work that he has done for us and consult on that. And I would encourage every member in here to encourage their local people to get involved in that consultation so that we can take forward some of the issues that older people face when it comes to vulnerability and the hostility and the hate crime around their age.
And David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be well aware that Action on Elder Abuse gave evidence to the Justice Committee in February, and they believe the real reason older people are targeted is due to their perceived vulnerability. Is Scotland meeting its international human rights commitments towards older people? And finally, should there be a specific offence of elder abuse?
Again, can I thank Dave Stewart for that question, and it ties into the answer to the last question, that vulnerability is a very, very clear theme that we are working on through Lord Bracadale's recommendations. He recognised that older people can be targeted and perpetrators can target them because of the perception of their age and their vulnerability. So vulnerability is a very clear aspect in where we're looking at, and the consultation has looked at age-related hostility, and within that is about age and vulnerability. So we're very happy to hear any other comments that he has on that, but absolutely we're taking this forward with a serious mind.
Thank you. Question number 5, Neil Findlay.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment the Scottish Prison Service carries out of prisoners when they're first convicted.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Every person who is received into a Scottish prison, whether on remand or conviction, is subject to a multi-tiered assessment process. They will get a reception risk assessment conducted by SPS staff. That identifies immediate requirements and risks relating to social care, self-harm, addictions. They'll get a healthcare assessment which is carried out by NHS professionals. And for those that are serving more than 7 days, they'll get a further core screen which is conducted. Individuals are also asked if they have children or dependents and whether they've served in the military.
Neil Findlay.
The prison population is very disproportionately made up of people who on conviction are in poverty, experiencing addiction or homelessness, yet the Scottish Prison Service nor the Scottish Government can tell us how many people were in these circumstances prior to going to prison. So how can we possibly address these very serious issues when we have no idea of the extent of the problem?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I thank Neil Findlay for raising the question again? I take some issue with the characterisation, but I think the general point that he's making is absolutely a very valid one. There is a lot of people in our prisons that have addictions, that have issues around their housing situation, that have issues around their mental health, that frankly, when it comes to those issues, if they were addressed, they would probably not be veering into the criminal justice system at all. And we have a shared responsibility, and of course the government takes that responsibility on around looking at interventions before they get into the criminal justice system to deal with these issues. The second point I'd make, which I think is a very valid one that Neil Findlay raises, is that we need to get better at the information sharing between social work, between the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, between the Scottish Prison Service and other agencies. And to give them the reassurance, I've asked for a meeting of those agencies and indeed for our Justice Board, which makes up those stakeholders and many more, to examine this information sharing, because the more information we have in an individual, the better our interventions can be. The better our interventions, the more chance there is of rehabilitation. The more chance there is of rehabilitation, the less chance there is of victims and of crime. So therefore we have safer communities for all.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. As the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged, mental health checks in our prisons are essential, yet only 2 mental health professionals have been added to the prison workforce since more were promised in March 2017. Meantime, both the prison population and self-harm incidents have soared. Is the Cabinet Secretary concerned that we may actually have seen a decrease per head in access to mental health services in our prisons? And how many of the 800 extra mental health workers will be allocated to the prison estate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Liam MacArthur for raising this question, again acknowledge his interest in this particular issue. Again, I'll try to give him a couple of reassurances. The first is to say that the processes that SPS have in relation to identifying practices of self-harm has greatly improved. In 2017, there was a further quality assurance process, and it'd be fair to say that some of the rising numbers we see are actually because the reporting mechanism is a lot better perhaps than in previous years. But that's not to say that there aren't issues in and around self-harm in our prison. We are dealing with often very complex issues and complex individuals. Myself and the Health Secretary and the Minister for Mental Health have a regular conversation about the needs in prisons. There is, of course, as he will know, a mental health review taking place, which will look at mental health provision within prisons. But also what I would say to him is a specific issue of our young people. He'll be aware that there's a review ongoing in Parliament in relation to the mental health provision therein. And of course, I will report to Parliament once that review has been completed.
Question number 6, Claire Baker.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met ScotRail and what issues were discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
I last met with Alex Hines, Managing Director of ScotRail Alliance, on the 23rd of January and will meet him on the 24th of April. My officials remain in regular and constant liaison with ScotRail about a full range of operational issues which requires to be delivered by ScotRail.
Claire Baker.
The Cabinet Secretary may be aware of the packed public meeting in Kirkcaldy a few weeks ago, organised by Leslie Laird MP with Alex Hines from ScotRail, where Fife travellers strongly expressed their frustration and their anger with delayed, cancelled and overcrowded trains. Commuters were told at this meeting not to expect the peak time service to return to normal until at least December. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that Fife commuters are being badly let down by this appalling service? And will he work with ScotRail to deliver a cut in fares until services return to normal in recognition of the unacceptable service that Fifers are experiencing?
Cabinet Secretary.
Sign Officer, the member will be aware that we have raised concerns with ScotRail regarding their performance on the Fife Circle and also in other parts of the network in Scotland, which is why we triggered them the issuing of a remedial notice which was issued to ScotRail on the 24th of December, which now requires them to bring forward a remedial plan which has been submitted to the Scottish Government to Transport Scotland to be considered, and we are now at the very advanced stages of entering that into a remedial agreement. That is specifically about addressing the concerns that our constituents and others who have experienced disruption with ScotRail's performance, that these issues are addressed on a consistent, ongoing basis. A key part of that, though, is about making sure that they get access to the rolling stock, which will help to improve performance, including additional capacity on routes such as in Fife, which has been delayed because of failures by Wabtec to have the refurbishment work carried out, and also the delays being caused by Hitachi in the delivery of the new 385 trains as well, all of which have had a systematic impact on the process. However, notwithstanding that, it's important we make sure that ScotRail have been held to account through the contract that they have with us for providing rail services, and that's exactly what the remedial plan is about doing, and we'll publish details of that in the coming days.
Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will indeed be aware from my regular correspondence with him that my constituents, I have to say this, quite frankly, are absolutely fed up with ScotRail's Fife Circle service. Has the Cabinet Secretary in fact received any up-to-date information from ScotRail, who are responsible for this mess, that would indicate that there is indeed any light at the end of the tunnel?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I fully recognise the frustration which our constituents have over a consistent period of time of poor performance across the Fife Circle. And as I mentioned in my earlier response, that's the very reason, one of the reasons why we triggered the issuing of a remedial notice to ScotRail in order to develop a remedial plan, not to address these very issues that our constituents are experiencing. And we're now at that very advanced stage of entering into that remedial agreement with ScotRail in order to make sure that it is effectively implemented and addresses the types of concerns which our constituents have, and we will announce more details of that in the coming days.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. And before we move on to First Minister's questions, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to our gallery Talat Zaferi MP, President of the Assembly of the Republic of North Macedonia. Thank you. And before we move to the first question, could I invite the First Minister to make a few remarks following the tragic events in Christchurch in New Zealand?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do want to begin today with heartfelt condolences to the people of New Zealand after last week's appalling terrorist attack in Christchurch. I hope that people in New Zealand can take some comfort from the knowledge that people across the world stand in solidarity with them. Events in New Zealand have been felt deeply here in Scotland as in other countries, and perhaps especially in our Muslim community. Last week, Police Scotland arranged reassurance patrols and visits to mosques and to other places of worship. I visited Glasgow Central Mosque on Friday with the Justice Secretary. The Prime Minister of New Zealand has said that nations around the world are now engaged in a global fight against far-right, racist and extremist ideology. Regrettably, she is absolutely right. All of us have a responsibility to engage in that fight. We must tackle hatred and prejudice through the words that we use, the actions that we take and the climate that we create. And I know that all parties in this chamber will play their part in doing that. Presiding Officer, in the last week we have also seen an attack in Utrecht and the stabbing of a teenager in Surrey, and our condolences are with all of those affected by those incidents as well. Let us today express sympathy and solidarity with the victims of racist and extremist violence in Christchurch and around the world. And above all, let us make clear our determination that the proponents of hate will be defeated by the values of kindness, compassion and love.
Thank you. We turn now to our questions. The first question from Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I associate all of us in the Scottish Conservatives with the remarks the First Minister has just made and offer support for any measures required to reassure those who are attending mosques in Scotland? Many of Scots will have friends and family who live or visit regularly to New Zealand who will have been deeply affected. However, for many in Scotland's Muslim community, events on the other side of the world must never have felt closer to home. As we embrace them with our good wishes and condolences, we must, as the First Minister said, work together to think afresh what must be done by us all to counter this defining 21st century scourge. Presiding Officer, over the last 10 years, the SNP has launched 2 major drug strategies. And during those 10 years, drug deaths have tragically now doubled. We are now on course to have the largest number of deaths per head than anywhere else in Europe. Does the First Minister believe the strategies have been a success or a failure?
First Minister.
These are challenging issues, and I readily concede that the government, this government, any government, has to remain open to fresh thinking and new ideas. On the issue of drugs death, the situation is not one that any of us would consider to be acceptable. But as I think I said in the Chamber last week, many of the people who have died have lived with alcohol and drug use for a long time. They become more vulnerable as they grow older as a result of their complex health and social needs. What is more encouraging, although I'm not overstating this point, is that the last report showed fewer deaths in the under 25 population, and recent reports also highlight falling heroin use, particularly again in the under 25s. Work is underway, as I'm sure Jackson Carlow is aware, in both Dundee and Glasgow to consider what more can be done to tackle drug deaths. And of course, that work will be of relevance across Scotland, and we want to see the outcomes of this work before considering what further action we should be taking.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, I thank the First Minister for that. We all want to help sort this crisis, but the first step is surely to admit that the current policy isn't working as it should. Regrettably, it has been a failure, and here's an example of that. We know rehabilitation services in prisons can be vital to turning around people's lives. Yet, as my colleague Adam Tompkins has discovered in recent days, in one of our biggest prisons, Barlinnie, a successful, voluntarily funded recovery project, a cafe where people can go and get their lives back on track, is now facing closure. Now, how can it be right that we are prioritising spending millions of the pounds we do spend on methadone programmes and successful projects like this are otherwise put at risk?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say to Jackson Carlow and indeed to Adam Tompkins, the Justice Secretary has received a letter on this issue, and that will be responded to in due course. I think it's important to advise the Chamber that the Scottish Government has not previously funded recovery cafes, but we do provide funding for what is called the Scottish Recovery Consortium. And of course, the Scottish Prison Service adopts a therapeutic approach in dealing with the issues of addiction and provides support for those with addiction problems in their care. And the new alcohol and drug strategy highlights the importance of recovery communities and the need for them to be at the very heart of any proposals. They also help to reduce stigma because they provide a visible face of recovery as well as insights into addiction and harm. So through our sustained funding of the Scottish Recovery Consortium, we will continue to do what we can to support the growth of recovery communities across the country. And of course, we'll give consideration to the points that have been made in Adam Tompkins' letter.
Jackson Carla.
Yes, in this mix of approaches, my question was not intended as a criticism, but just a few miles from Parliament is Castle Craig Hospital near West Linton, a drug rehabilitation centre with capacity for residential drug rehab patients, visited recently by our health spokesman, Miles Briggs. Now, they told him that Castle Craig is not receiving NHS referrals and is now mostly being kept going by patients who are being referred from the Netherlands for treatment. Now, isn't the First Minister, like me, concerned that Dutch patients are getting better access to this Scottish rehabilitation project here in Scotland than Scots locally in need of the same support and treatment?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I am very happy to look into that specific example. We want people to have access to rehabilitation services and a broad range of rehabilitation services. We are providing, as the Scottish Government, £70 million in this financial year to help reduce the harms caused by alcohol and drugs, and that includes an additional £20 million for drug and alcohol services, which are allocated to support new approaches so that we are responding in a much more joined up and person-centred way. And that kind of investment is important. It's also important, and again, I'm not trying to make a party political point here about a very serious issue. It is important that we are prepared to take forward innovative and evidence-based new approaches, even if at first they can seem to be very challenging, particularly for public opinion. And that is why we supported the principles behind Glasgow's proposals for a medically supervised, safer drug consumption facility and heroin-assisted treatment in the city. And I think it's important that we work with health and social care partnerships on new approaches, as well as making sure that we are investing in rehabilitation. And I hope that is something that the Conservatives will think about giving us support on, because of course we do need to persuade the UK Government to do what is required.
Jackson Carla.
Yes, I do respect the First Minister's approach on that. It is something we have looked at. It's unfortunately that one policy, one where we do fundamentally disagree. And we do think the policy should be to get people clean of drugs, not to provide opportunities where they can take them. But Scottish Conservatives have set out a clear plan to help tackle Scotland's growing drug crisis, getting first-time offenders into treatment, directing more money into rehabilitation programmes run by third sector bodies, and at the same time at least reviewing the failed methadone programme. Presiding Officer, we're actually not, let's admit it, overrun at the moment in politics by issues around which we can form any kind of consensus. But on this one vital issue, would the First Minister commit today to working across this chamber, because we will, to improve the drug strategy for the next 10 years, so that we do cut drug deaths, we do cut drug addiction, and we come down hard on those peddling misery across our communities?
First Minister. Well, can I reiterate my willingness to work across the chamber? I've said, I think, in a couple of my responses today, that I will consider the points that Jackson Carlaw had raised, and I give that assurance again. I would ask for that in return, though. Yeah. And I am slightly concerned at the almost knee-jerk way that Jackson Carlaw ruled out the fresh thinking around safer drug consumption facilities. If we are genuinely to try to find a consensus, we have to be open to new thinking, and sometimes that will be very tough and very, very challenging. So I would appeal to Jackson Carlaw perhaps to reconsider his opposition to that, just as he is asking me to be open-minded to any proposals that he makes. We will continue to make sure that we have the right strategies in place to deal with what I think we all accept is a challenging and complex issue. That involves taking a very hard line against those who supply drugs, and we saw figures earlier this week about police seizures of drugs. It definitely involves support, particularly rehabilitation support for those who are addicted to drugs. And thirdly, it does involve being open to new ideas and new thinking. And I think if we can all agree broadly around that, then perhaps we can build a consensus that allows us in Scotland to tackle what we all agree is unacceptable, and we want to see a considerably improved situation around. So I hope that we have Jackson Carlaw and the Conservative support on that.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Can I add the deep-felt condolences of the Scottish Labour Party to the family and friends of all those who lost their lives in the terror attack in Christchurch last Friday, and to offer our support for practical action to defeat racism and hatred wherever it occurs. To ask the First Minister why there is a staffing crisis in the NHS.
First Minister.
There is not a staffing crisis in the National Health Service. There are record numbers of people working in the National Health Service. In fact, I can tell Richard Leonard that staffing levels in NHS Scotland are now at a record high and are up by over 13,600 since 2006, just before this government took office. Numbers of consultants are up by 51%, qualified nurses and midwives up by 8%. There is higher NHS staffing per head in Scotland than there is in NHS England. Our NHS staff, of course, work under considerable pressure, and we're grateful to them for the job that they do. But we will continue to invest in our NHS to ensure record numbers of staff so that they can continue to deliver the excellent services that they do.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, this week, this Parliament's Health and Sport Committee, following the tragic events at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, began its inquiry into infection control standards. And new figures released to Scottish Labour this week reveal that the number of domestic staff, that is cleaners, employed at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is falling. In March 2018, 464 cleaners were employed at the hospital. But according to latest figures, that number has dropped to 440. First Minister, why at the very point when it is facing a rise in infection outbreaks is Scotland's biggest hospital employing fewer people on the front line whose job it is to keep that hospital clean and safe?
First Minister.
I'm sure Richard Leonard will have heard the Health Secretary already address this issue publicly. This is an issue that has been raised with Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. It is absolutely imperative that all health boards in all hospitals ensure appropriate numbers of domestic and cleaning staff. Of course, it is for health boards to consider the configuration of staffing, as Richard Leonard will know, and those of us who represent Glasgow constituencies know particularly well. There has been a significant change in the configuration of Glasgow hospitals over the last number of years, and the overall staffing numbers will undoubtedly reflect that. The last point I would make is this. We will continue to raise issues directly with health boards to make sure that they are addressed where that is necessary. But notwithstanding the very serious incidents that we've seen at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and we've discussed them on many occasions in this chamber before, and I welcome the Health Committee's inquiry into these issues. Overall, in Scottish hospitals, infection rates are down considerably. I think I heard, I can see Jackie Bailey in the chamber just now, when her and I used to regularly have exchanges about the levels of C. diff in our hospitals after the tragic incident at the Vale of Leven. C. diff, MRSA, infections generally are down in some cases by more than 80%. So let's tackle issues where they arise. Richard Leonard is right to raise these issues, but let's not lose sight of the good work that has been done in our NHS to reduce infection and to put a real focus on patient safety.
Richard Leonard.
Well, Presiding Officer, I should also make it clear that this is not unique to one hospital. It is replicated right across NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. There are fewer domestics, fewer porters, fewer laundry and linen staff compared to last year. First Minister, it's clear that we have a staffing crisis in our health service, and it's not confined to consultants, nurses and midwives. It's facility staff, it's domestics, it's catering workers, it's porters, and it's laundry staff too. All workers without whom no hospital can operate. So, we know there is a parliamentary inquiry, and reviews are being carried out by the Health Board and by the Government. But this is serious, and it's urgent, and the public and those under pressure staff need a commitment today that this reduction in these vital frontline jobs is reversed as soon as possible. Is the First Minister prepared today to give them that commitment?
First Minister.
We will continue, as I said earlier on, to work with health boards, including Greater Glasgow and Clyde, to make sure that they have appropriate staffing levels across all specialties within the NHS, and that is important. I would repeat what I've already said. There are record numbers of staff working in our National Health Service. Richard Leonard says these issues are urgent, and I couldn't agree more. I know how devastating infection outbreaks are in hospitals, principally for patients, their families, but also for the staff who work in our hospitals. That's why the Healthcare Environment Inspectorate report that was commissioned and instructed by the Health Secretary into the Queen Elizabeth has already reported, and the recommendations that have been made have already been accepted by the Health Board and are being implemented. So whatever disagreements we have and whatever legitimate points, and they are legitimate points that Richard Leonard raises, I don't think anybody could doubt the seriousness of this government and indeed the seriousness of the health service when it comes to tackling infections in our hospitals. And overall, the figures say that things are going in the right direction, but that does not take away from the need to tackle serious incidents when they arise, and we will continue to do exactly that.
Thank you. We turn to some constituency supplementaries. Liam Kerr to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Very grateful, Presiding Officer. Cove Harbour fishing community is suffering. First, their landing was bought and closed by a private landlord. They went to court and won the public rights of access, but faced significant legal costs. Several boats were then destroyed in a fire, and now the landlord has closed access to the beach. They've written several times to the Cabinet Secretary, Fergus Ewing, requesting a meeting, even if it's in Holyrood, to discuss their rights and their future, but to no avail. So would the First Minister ask the Cabinet Secretary to meet them and not risk ignoring a community facing the loss of their livelihoods?
First Minister.
Well, of course, we want to do everything we possibly can to help any community experiencing difficulties. I'm not aware beyond what the member has just said of the content of the correspondence to Fergus Ewing, but I'm happy to give an undertaking to look into that. And if Fergus Ewing thinks there is help the Scottish Government can offer, certainly to meet with those affected.
Alistair Allen to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Presiding Officer, earlier this week, Ofgem announced that it was minded to reject proposals for a 600-megawatt transmission link to the Western Isles, instead saying that it would support a much-reduced 450-megawatt link. This has been met with extreme disappointment in my constituency, as it will severely constrain capacity for future community projects and place projects from the Western Isles potentially at a disadvantage. What pressure can the Scottish Government bring on Ofgem and indeed the UK Government to reconsider this short-sighted decision?
First Minister.
Well, we are absolutely committed to unlocking the vast renewables potential of our islands and the associated economic benefits for our island communities. We are very concerned at the uncertainty over the proposed connection from the Western Isles. The Scottish Government believes that for the full renewables potential of the Western Isles to be realised, a larger link is required. So I very much agree with the sentiments of Alistair Allen's question. We have made arguments to support this point directly to Ofgem, and we will continue to do so as we engage further with Ofgem, with island stakeholders and with developers during the ongoing consultation process. And I can assure Alistair Allen and the Chamber that we will make absolutely every effort to secure the right outcome for the Western Isles.
Jackie Bailey to be followed by Miles Briggs.
The First Minister will be aware that my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal has spent more than 500 days detained in prison in the Punjab. There have been accusations of torture, and he has now faced his 77th pre-trial preliminary hearing. His MP, Martin Doherty-Hughes, is to be commended for pursuing the matter vigorously. But will the First Minister use her influence and speak to the Foreign Secretary and UK Government to urge them to provide support and assistance to Mr Johal and his family?
First Minister.
Can I thank Jackie Bailey for raising this issue? I know she has raised it previously, and as she's right to say, the MP Martin Doherty-Hughes has been assiduous in raising the rights and situation of his constituent. We have raised this issue and will continue to do so. The Deputy First Minister has raised it directly with Indian ministers on recent visits to India. He has raised it with the British High Commission, and I believe, although I will double check this, we have raised this directly with the Foreign Office, and I'm happy to undertake that we will do so again, and thank Jackie Bailey for raising the issue.
Miles Briggs.
First Minister, in recent weeks I've received contact from families across Scotland who are facing unacceptable waits for cleft surgery. 2 years ago, we warned SNP ministers about the impact of the closure of the Edinburgh unit and centralisation of cleft services. This Parliament voted against the centralisation, but ministers pressed on against the will of this Parliament. One case highlighted to me just this week is a young man who's been waiting now 2 years for promised final surgery and is no way further forward in when he will receive this. Families are also telling me now they're looking to NHS England to receive this surgery. Can the First Minister apologise to families for these waits, and what will she do to correct a mistake this government made?
First Minister.
Well, as I've said many times before in the Chamber, I regret where any patient has to wait longer for treatment than we would want it to be the case. On the issue of cleft surgery, the redesign of that service, as I recall, was on clinical grounds to make sure a quality and safe service. If Miles Briggs would like to give further details of the constituents who are raising issues with him, the Health Secretary will look into those and correspond further with him when she's had the opportunity to do so.
Turn to question 3, Patrick Harvey.
On behalf of the Scottish Greens, can I join with others in expressing our shared concern for the bereaved and the injured following the far-right terrorist attack in New Zealand, but also our respect for the response that country is showing, recommitting to the values of their inclusive society and refusing to placate the far right as far too many politicians around the world have done. Presiding Officer, last night, in the midst of a crisis of our own making, the Prime Minister again refused to listen to reason and instead effectively told the public that Parliament is their enemy. Scotland needs the freedom to take a different direction, leave behind this chaos and find our own way out of the crisis. It's why we need our independence. The First Minister told us that she would say something about her preferred timing within weeks. That was 2 months ago. So can I ask again, when?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I agree with Patrick Harvey that the Prime Minister's comments last night were deeply irresponsible, and I hope that in time she will reflect on that. But her comments also failed to accept any of the responsibility she bears for the mess that the UK is in right now. She wanted to blame everybody except herself, and yet I think most people know that it was the Prime Minister who triggered Article 50 without a plan. It was the Prime Minister who drew self-defeating, contradictory lead lines that boxed her in from the start. It was the Prime Minister who called an unnecessary general election, who delayed the first vote on her deal in an attempt to run down the clock. It was the Prime Minister who failed to listen and change course after the first defeat of her deal and then again after the second. She must change course now before it is too late, and she must bear responsibility for the mess this country is in. On the issue of independence, the frustration people feel right now at our country, Scotland's future, being determined by the DUP and a cabal of right-wing Tories is understandable, and I absolutely share it. I said I'd wait until the end of this phase of the Brexit negotiations before setting out my views on the way forward for Scotland. Having done so this long, I think it is reasonable to wait to see what clarity emerges in the next few days, even if I suspect that will just be clarity that there will be no clarity. And then I will set out my views on the path forward. But there is no doubt, nobody can be in any doubt that change is needed. The last 3 years have shown that the status quo is broken. It cannot protect Scotland from the folly of Brexit and all that flows from that. Even the most ardent unionist must see that the way we are governed now by Westminster is broken. The question is, how do we fix that for the future? And there's no doubt in my mind that letting people in Scotland choose an independent future is the best way to do that.
Patrick Harvey.
At every stage of this nightmare, this Parliament has tried to persuade the Prime Minister to change course. We've called for the narrow 2016 result and Scotland's Remain vote to be respected. We've called for our place in the single market to be protected. We've called for the public to have the right of a final say and the chance to cancel this crisis. If the Prime Minister succeeds in closing off all of these positive choices and the country finds itself being driven to the edge of the cliff next week, this time next week, if that happens, does the First Minister agree that MPs must be prepared finally to put the public interest first and be willing, if all else fails, to do what's necessary and revoke Article 50?
Briefer, First Minister.
Yes, and indeed the SNP at Westminster and the Greens and the Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru issued a joint statement last night to that effect. SNP MPs will not vote for the Prime Minister's deal because it is a bad deal that will damage Scottish interests, and I don't think any Scottish MP should vote for such a deal. But nor will we accept her framing that it is a choice between her deal and no deal. Just because she's not willing to contemplate the alternatives doesn't mean that there aren't any alternatives. One of those alternatives, undoubtedly, is the revocation of Article 50. And if all else fails by this time next week, that is exactly, in my view, what MPs should do.
Question for Willie Rennie.
Can I associate myself and my party with the remarks of the First Minister about New Zealand? The events in that country were truly sickening. You wouldn't think that we were in the middle of a national crisis if you just listened to the questions from the leaders of the Conservative and Labour parties. But I have to say the last thing this country needs is more division and chaos with independence to compound the division and chaos of Brexit. The first duty of a Prime Minister is to keep the country safe. Yet because of the cavalier choices of this Prime Minister, emergency measures under Operation Yellowhammer have been triggered. Medicines, food supply chains, transport, all at risk. Does the First Minister agree with me that no serious Prime Minister should ever threaten such catastrophic consequences, no matter how much she wants her policy to pass?
First Minister.
Well, before I address that, can I just say to the first part of Willie Rennie's question there, the inconsistency in Willie Rennie's position is this. He wants people across the UK to have the ability to escape Brexit through a second referendum, and I agree with him on that. But if that doesn't prove to be possible, he thinks that Scotland should just grin and bear it and put up with the devastation of Brexit, instead of Scotland having the choice to escape Brexit and have an independent future. That is a deeply inconsistent position for him to take, and I hope he'll reflect on it. On the issue of Yellowhammer, which of course is the emergency planning for a no-deal Brexit, I do think it is beyond comprehension that any Prime Minister could be knowingly allowing the country to be 8 days, now round about 200 hours away from that possibility of crashing out of the EU without a deal and requiring that emergency planning work to be done. I, yesterday, as I have done once a week for several weeks now, chaired a meeting of the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee looking at medicines supplies, food supplies, transport links in the event of a no-deal Brexit. It is outrageous that we are having to expend time, energy and resources in doing so. The Prime Minister really must, before any more time passes and before it is too late, change course, take no deal off the table completely, look at building a broader consensus rather than pandering to the hardliners in our own party, and if necessary, dumping Brexit completely. That would be in the best interest of the country.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister is wrong. The inconsistency is that to believe that breaking up an economic partnership of 40 years will be chaotic, but breaking up one of 300 years will be a piece of cake.
Order, please.
She is the inconsistent one. People are scunnered by this agonising Brexit process. 3 years on, 200 hours left. Isn't it time for a common sense approach? Common sense where we have a Prime Minister who takes a no-deal Brexit off the table instead of using it as a threat against her own citizens. Where party leaders, all party leaders, can sit down and talk without the leader of the opposition walking out because he doesn't like Chuka Amuna, where the Prime Minister reaches out to MPs in Parliament rather than insulting them from behind a podium in Number 10. Common sense, where we admit that Parliament is incapable of deciding, so we have a public vote to let the people decide. Isn't it time for that common sense approach?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree with all of that. I think people across the UK should have the opportunity to vote again, given everything they now know that wasn't known in 2016, which is why I'll be calling for that in London on Saturday, with many others, no doubt hundreds of thousands of others in London. And I agree with everything he said about the Prime Minister. I agree with him in his despair about the leader of the Labour Party and his childish behaviour last night, when what we need to see is people coming together to find an alternative. Where I disagree with him is in his view that if all of what he has just called for fails, then Scotland should just be powerless in the face of the disaster of Brexit. I oppose Brexit as he does, but there was nothing inevitable about the chaos of Brexit. That was down to those who proposed it having no idea what it looked like in reality and doing no planning for it. It did not have to be that way. And again, I would say to Willie Rennie, the inconsistency is him standing up here rightly spelling out the disaster that Brexit will be, but then saying, if all else fails, Scotland just has to put up with it. Well, I don't think Scotland has to put up with it, and I don't think Scotland should have to put up with it. If it comes to it, Scotland choosing independence is a much brighter future than remaining part of Brexit Britain.
We have some additional supplementaries. The first from Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Prime Minister last night claimed that the public have had enough. Today, a petition on the UK Parliament website calling for Article 50 to be revoked is already well on the way to 1 million signatures. Support is growing so fast that the website crashed harder than the Prime Minister's credibility. Isn't it the case that if the Prime Minister believes that she has the people with her, she should have the courage to put that to the test and call for a people's vote?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. As I said, I thought the Prime Minister's statement last night was deeply regrettable. I think for her to be blaming everybody except herself beggars belief. And now is the time, I think, for people across parties to speak out. I mean, I watched last night one of the most powerful contributions that I've ever seen in the House of Commons. Dominic Grieve, a moderate Tory, I think everybody would accept, an honourable person, having the honesty to say that he was ashamed to be in the Conservative Party, and the conduct of the Prime Minister made him want to weep. And yet we hear Scottish Conservatives continue to parrot the lines of the Prime Minister. And I often wonder if Jackson Carlaw ever, in his quieter moments, thinks that it might be better for the country, indeed for his own reputation, for him to actually say what I believe he probably thinks, that this is a mess. Carrying on regardless is a profound mistake. The Prime Minister must change course, and she must do so now before it's too late.
Daniel Johnson, to be followed by...
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that the British Retail Consortium annual crime survey was published today. It records that 115 shop workers were physically attacked at work every single day across the UK last year. Asda estimate that the real problem can be much greater. Their estimate is that 34 retail workers are attacked every day in Scotland alone. My bill to protect shop workers is in the final stages of drafting. So can I ask the First Minister what she thinks needs to be done to tackle this growing problem? And will her government work with me to look at what changes in the law may be needed to do so? Because everyone has the right to safety at work, whether they work in an office or on the shop floor.
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Daniel Johnson for raising this issue and the results of the British Retail Consortium survey. I think it is a very powerful reminder that our shop workers do an essential job, but they do a job that is often dangerous to them, and we all owe them a huge debt of gratitude. Yes, we will be happy to work with Daniel Johnson and with others to look at what further protections we need to put in place. I note that he says his own bill is in the final stages of drafting. We will look very carefully at that when it is published, and be happy to consider that and discuss that with him. So yes, we will be happy to try to build consensus.
And Mark MacDonald.
On 1st of April, employer contributions to NHS pension schemes will increase from 14.9% to 20.9%. Children's hospices across Scotland have estimated that the increased cost to them will be the equivalent to the salary of 9 full-time nurses. The UK Government have stated that charities and hospices are included in the funding provided to NHS England to cover costs of the increase, but CHAS say similar commitments have not yet been made to Scottish charities and hospices. Can I ask the First Minister if the Scottish Government will provide funding to help charities and hospice organisations meet this cost increase and ensure they do not have to divert money from the vital support services they provide?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Mark MacDonald for raising this issue? He's right to do so. It is a concerning issue generally, but in particular for hospices and charities. The Scottish Government has been in discussions with the BMA about how to best disperse additional funding to practices to meet this change, and we will continue to do so. And I will specifically ask the Health Secretary to look particularly at the issue of hospices and charities and to come back to Mark MacDonald when she's had the opportunity to do so.
Question number 5, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister, in light of the reported travel chaos on the Borders Railway last weekend as a result of a number of train cancellations, whether the Scottish Government considers that the ScotRail franchise continues to be sustainable.
First Minister.
Well, I'm disappointed that passengers across a number of routes on the ScotRail network continue to be affected by train cancellations as a consequence of ScotRail's training backlog. Although there is evidence of some improvement in ScotRail's performance at a national level, this will do little to reassure passengers who attempted to travel on the Borders Railway last Sunday and were faced with an unacceptable number of cancellations. That is why ScotRail's focus must remain on delivering a robust remedial plan which puts passenger interest at the forefront of restoring performance levels. The remedial plan has been specifically designed to mitigate against train crew and train fleet challenges, and I fully expect ScotRail to ensure that the plan is delivered to reaffirm passenger confidence in the railway.
Christine Graham.
Thank the First Minister for the answer. And there was indeed a service breakdown and meltdown on Sunday in the Borders Railway. Well, it was a breakdown as well. And the cancellations continue. They've continued since that. They've continued today. I heard the Cabinet Secretary talking about the remedial notice, and the second one served the plan requires to be delivered soon. Well, the plan might be delivered, but that doesn't deliver trains. Plans don't drive trains. Isn't it time that the Scottish Government told ScotRail and Abellio that it's in the last chance saloon? I certainly think so, and so do my constituents.
First Minister.
Well, I would say to Christine Graham that ScotRail should treat a remedial plan very much as a last chance saloon. That's the very nature of it. ScotRail has been left in no doubt that its recent levels of performance, particularly in the Borders and Fife, have been completely unacceptable. I've said as much in this chamber. I heard Michael Matheson say so a moment ago as well, when members like Annabel Ewing were raising very legitimate and understandable concerns on behalf of their constituents. We've used contractual mechanisms contained within the franchise agreement to require the remedial plan, and ScotRail will publish its performance remedial plan on its website shortly. The commitments contained in the plan have been contracted as a remedial agreement. Of course, in the event ScotRail does not achieve improved performance or fails to deliver on its contractual commitments, it does of course run the risk of the franchise being terminated early.
Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I recently received a letter from a concerned Borders Railway commuter. He says in his letter, and I quote, "It has come to the point where there is genuine surprise that the train is running on time as opposed to it being so frequently cancelled." He goes on to say, "The negative effects of this are significant. There is a financial penalty imposed by the nursery as a result of collecting my daughter. There is also significant stress and anxiety because of the lateness to my work. Will the First Minister apologise on behalf of her Transport Secretary to the hundreds of commuters experiencing transport hell, and will she personally oversee the remedial plan that has been submitted by ScotRail, which will be published in the next few days?"
First Minister.
Well, the Transport Secretary will oversee that. That is part of his responsibilities, and obviously, as First Minister, I will retain a very close interest in that as well. I have made very clear, I don't think I could make clearer, that some of the recent performance levels of ScotRail have been completely unacceptable. That is particularly, but not exclusively, the case on the Borders Railway. I could stand here and talk about some of the reasons behind that in terms of train delivery, training requirements, not specifically in relation to the Borders Railway, but in relation, for example, to some of the issues we've seen coming in and out of Edinburgh in the last couple of days to Network Rail failings. But I'm not going to do that, because it is ScotRail's responsibility to make sure that they live up to their performance levels. That's why the remedial plan is so important, and why ScotRail has to understand how serious the obligation is on them to deliver on the commitments they make in it.
And Mark Ruskell.
Commuters are suffering poor rail services across Scotland, and especially in Fife. Last year, the Transport Minister, Mr Yousaf, said in this chamber, and I quote, "There will be an upgrade in the rolling stock later in 2018 or early in 2019. Nevertheless, people in Fife should not have to wait for that to get an improvement in their service." So why is it now that Fife commuters are being told it will be the end of 2019 at the very earliest before any improvements come through? Does the First Minister not believe that it's time for her to personally step in and take charge of the ScotRail crisis?
First Minister.
Well, I've made my views clear, and I will do so again. Those who are charged with and also remunerated with the responsibility of running our railways are the ones that have to get it right. And they have a responsibility to do so, and they have a responsibility to begin delivering the improvements that passengers want to see immediately, and that is what the remedial plan will very much focus on. Of course, there is significant investment in our railways. There is a renewal of rolling stock. There's a lot of very positive work that I hope passengers start to get the benefit of very, very soon. But ScotRail must address the reasons, those at least that are within its responsibility behind its dip in performance, and we expect them to do that, and to do that very, very quickly.
Question number 6, Liz Smith.
To ask the First Minister, in light of the parliamentary reports by both MSPs and MPs, what the Scottish Government's response is to the growing concerns about the effect of social media on the mental health of young people across Scotland.
First Minister.
We welcome the report published by the Public Audit Committee last week, which looked at the relationship between social media and mental health. The report made recommendations regarding the need for further research in this area, and next month we will publish initial research examining the links between unhealthy social media use and lower mental well-being, particularly in girls and young women. We're also committed to developing and publishing Scotland-specific advice on how young people can use social media in a healthy way, and this will be co-produced by young people for young people, and will be informed by the research that we'll publish next month.
Liz Smith.
Could I thank the First Minister for that helpful answer? I'm sure that the whole chamber can unite in its deep concern about the shocking statistics which reveal that 60% of 16 to 25-year-olds believe that social media places, and I quote, overwhelming pressure on their age group, and that mental health referrals have increased by 22% since 2014. Just some of the facts which quite rightly have led MSPs and MPs to state categorically that we all have a duty of care to protect vulnerable users. So, as well as the answer that the First Minister has just given me, could I ask her to give us some details about the timescale that she envisages for the implementation of the Task Force delivery plan?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I agree very much with the sentiments and the detail of Liz Smith's question. The internet and social media should be, and in many respects is, a force for good that we should embrace and welcome. But it also does put considerable pressures on young people, and I think particularly on young girls. All of us will have young girls, or many of us will have young girls in our family. I've got a niece who's about to enter her teenage years, and it is not difficult to see that pressure that is there. So we must make sure that our young people are equipped to deal with that properly. I've already referred to some of the research that we'll publish and some of the work that will flow from that. In terms of the task force, it is taking forward a substantial programme of work, and I'll ask the Mental Health Minister to write to Liz Smith with the precise timescales for the different delivery aspects of that work. But all of this is important work to make sure that we are preventing mental health issues and then providing treatment as quickly as possible where that is required. And part of prevention is undoubtedly encouraging and supporting a healthy use of social media.
And Willie Coffey.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware of the tragic death of a young 18-year-old girl in Kilmarnock last weekend, followed by the death of another youngster in Ayrshire only hours later. I understand there are no suspicious circumstances involved, but there seem to be a growing number of young people across Ayrshire who are ending their lives as a result of suicide. Clearly this is heartbreaking for the family and friends involved, but would the First Minister be able to offer some hope to youngsters and their families that services are there to help, and that if more can be done to help to end these awful tragedies, then it will be done?
First Minister.
Well, yes, I want to give that assurance. I won't comment on individual cases beyond saying that, of course, my thoughts and condolences are with the families concerned. I know the East Ayrshire Council are already looking at these incidents, I think, with the National Health Service, and they, of course, will want to make sure that they are responding appropriately. We are absolutely, I think this applies across the Chamber, committed to ensuring that as some of the challenges around mental health change and develop, then our response does so as well. I said before in the Chamber, the system as it has developed over many years sees too many young people referred to specialist services because there are not the services in the community looking both at prevention and early intervention. And much of the investment that we've announced recently, many of the initiatives that we are implementing now are trying to redress that balance so that we have a focus on prevention, on early intervention, but also in making sure that the specialist services are there when young people need them. And I hope and believe this is a programme of work that has support widely across the Chamber.
Thank you very much. And that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Christine Graham on men's share.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.